which then makes ethics impossible and completely subjectivistic. So this idea that good is what evokes approval, either social or individual, doesn't make any sense, cannot make meaningful the judgments on ethics that every unbeliever makes. And so we go the other direction. How about the idea that good is what achieves chosen ends? That is to say, something is good when it leads to a certain consequence, when it's the means to a particular end. Utilitarians tell us the good that we should try to achieve, the consequence that we are aiming for, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Hedonists that are egoistic, on the other hand, tell us the good we should be looking for is our own individual happiness, pleasure, and well-being. But now, either way, if good is what is conducive to the end that you have chosen, the question has now just been transferred from the means to the end that the means is supposed to be unto. That is to say, when the unbeliever says, I mean by good that which achieves social happiness or individual well-being, the next question is, well, why is the greatest happiness of the greatest number good? And you can't say because that achieves a certain end. If you define good in a consequentialist, or what is called a teleological fashion, if good is that which is conducive to a certain end, that already assumes that the end is itself good. And now we're right back into the thick of it. How do you know that that is good? And the unbelieving world doesn't have an answer for that. It's like, well, everyone's just supposed to take for granted that your individual well-being is good. You're just to take for granted that the happiness of your society is good. But even then we have to ask, in saying this, what do we mean by the word good? The unbeliever knows in his heart of hearts and her heart of hearts that good has to do with matching God's attitude toward things. Evil is that which goes contrary to God's feelings about certain things and against His character. And they use good, the language of goodness and evil, in that absolutistic way, and then they try to find some theory to cover it up. As Paul says, I find that you are very superstitious. You have all of this evidence of ethics around you in your society, and yet you can't make any sense of ethics, given your worldview. And so this God that you worship in ignorance, this absolute standard of goodness that you know is there but you cannot understand given your worldview, I can declare unto you. So there's one line that you can take, and I think everybody can understand this. Usually the discussion of moral right and wrong is not all that philosophically technical or difficult for people. Let's up the ante a bit here, though. Secondly, you can talk to people about the uniformity of nature, which is to say, the very possibility of doing science. You have to put on your thinking caps now. If we're going to talk about the uniformity of nature and the possibility of science, you have to stop and ask, why is this relevant to science? What does science study? When all's said and done, science studies predictability in human experience. When you do experiments in the chemistry lab or the physics lab, when you study engineering and how to build bridges and so forth, you are studying those things which, if you were to believe them, would enable you to control the world and control your experience better. If you knew the properties of quinine and how it acts on the human body, then you could predict that using quinine would relieve the symptoms of malaria. If you understood, your experiments in the medical lab, then you would find out something about the serum used to cure or prevent polio. The whole idea of science is we learn things about our past experience so that that knowledge will help us control our experience in the future. It's not just scientists who think that way. Every individual does so as well. You know how to ride a bike. You know how to drive a car. You don't learn that new every day. You take what you've learned in the past and you assume that that is usable in the future. That is to say that future experience will be like past experience. Now, there would be no science, there would be no university for that matter, if we couldn't count on the future being like the past, if we couldn't count on the uniformity of nature. Everyone assumes the uniformity of nature. And now the question you want to raise is, which worldview makes human experience, that is the expectation that the future will be like the past, that there's a causal connection in this world that you can rely on to make predictions and to plan your life and do things. Which worldview makes that human experience intelligible? Now, everyone assumes this, but no one's worldview can account for it apart from the Christian. You see, we have no experience of the future. We have no observation of the future. An unbeliever says we only know things based on our observations and experience. And then you're going to point out, well, then of course you haven't observed the future, have you? You have no experience of what is not yet. Now, since you believe everything you know is based on observation, and even you admit you have not observed the future, then anything you say about past experience, we've seen this in the laboratory 1,000 times. People have known this for thousands of years. You'll hear things like this. No matter what they say about the past, eventually you're going to point out is logically irrelevant to what's in the future. The fact that you have some observation, some experience, all these lab reports about the past still provides no relevant information about the way things will be in the future. It does not provide you any basis for expecting the future to be like the past, apart from a doctrine about the nature of reality that tells you that events and effects are controlled in a uniform way. Apart from, say, knowing a God who assures us that He will keep things regular in this universe and that our experience is predictable, therefore, apart from a doctrine like that, they couldn't have any rational basis for assuming the future would be like the past. And yet all of science assumes this. And then when you bring up the question, it's like they don't even want to think about that. It's so difficult and it's so taken for granted that they almost want to make fun of you for raising the question. But you have to remember, being made fun of for raising a question doesn't mean the question is a bad question. Often enough, it means you finally touched a nerve, and they don't want to admit that you've touched a nerve. Now, someone as sophisticated as Bertrand Russell, about whom you read in preparation for today's class, someone like Bertrand Russell has admitted in print and with a great deal of sophistication in the explanation that we just have to admit that the principle of induction, that is to say, the idea that we can take past experiences and project them into the future, that we can know and control the future to some degree by our knowledge of the past, has no foundation in observation, has no scientific foundation. So you can talk about moral absolutes with an unbeliever. You can talk about the very possibility of science and the uniformity of the world that would be required to do scientific work at all. Now I'm going to bump this up again. Let's raise the ante. I'm forcing you to think hard. This is going to be the hardest one of the day. After this, it's downhill. Another problem that unbelievers have, no matter what version of philosophy they use, whatever worldview they have, is that unbelievers have got to talk about the possibility of universals and laws. That is to say, they have got to talk about concepts and logic. In order to understand this challenge, we need to take a moment and explain what a universal is. You all know the story of Huey, Dewey, and Louie, right? When you see Huey, Dewey, and Louie out on the pond, you say there are three what? Oh, we're awake. Come on, come on, come on. Three ducks. Very good.